I currently have 136 chestnut trees in my orchard, and I plan to expand that to a little over 300 this spring. This all started in the fall of 2023 with just a couple of 5-pound bags of Chinese chestnut seeds. I selected Chinese chestnut trees because they're considered to be the most resistant to chestnut blight, and chestnut blight all but wiped out the American chestnut tree. So chestnut trees do not like water, and my soil is very well drained, and the pH levels ideally should be between 5.5 and 6.5, and mine was falling between 5.5 and 5.9. They also like deep and fertile soil, and this is maybe where my soil is not ideal. My soil starts with about 6 inches of topsoil, and then it turns into something that to me looks like a sandy clay. My soil test showed that half my nutrients were just inside the sufficient range on the low end, and the rest were below the recommended value, with nitrogen being quite low. So I have been spreading crimson clover seed. I purchased some the year I bought the property, and I've just been harvesting those seeds and spreading them out more and more as each season. I will also provide plenty of fertilization. I'm not quite sure what type or how I'm going to do that, but it's probably something I will have to for at least the first few years to keep the trees growing well. My trees also live on a hill, and it gets a fair amount of wind, so I am planning to plant some sort of windbreak with trees, something that'll grow faster than they will, thinking of something like green giants or something like that. Chestnut seeds are primarily harvested in the month of October. So this means if you want like viable and reputable seeds, you'll have to order these in September and October, and they will be delivered to you in October and November. So once you realize this, it's really more of a waiting game and a timing game, more so than trying to find your source. To find your sources, you can just do a quick search for Chinese chestnut seeds or American chestnut seeds for sale, whichever one you're looking for. To find local ones, what I found is you can just go to like Google Maps and you can search "you pick chestnuts," and then you'll usually find several places where you can go pick your chestnuts about as fresh as you can get them, picking them yourself. I ended up ordering mine online, and there are a couple of ways to find good resources for that. The first one is an organization called Chestnut Growers of America, and when you first go to their website, right up here at the top, there is the link that says Find a Grower. You click on that, and this is a whole list of chestnut growers by state. That doesn't tell a lot of information. You'll have to actually either do a search for the name or call the phone number, and you can ask them what type of chestnuts they sell. The one I found was here in Iowa, Valley Chestnuts. So I ordered a 5-pound bag from this company. That you can go right to their website. They have an email list that you can join, and then they send a notification to you when they are actually listing, or when they're actually selling their chestnuts for the year. Another one is the Northern Nut Growers. This one has, if you go to the resources link, you can click on nursery list, and it's a shorter list. But they have links to everything. Again, there's not a lot of information. You'll have to go and research each of the websites. So once you went through once you did your searches or you went through the list, you should create a list of whatever, a dozen or so websites, and then basically you just wait until September and October comes around. By about mid-September, if you join an email list, hopefully they're letting you know that they're taking orders. If not, you just go check the website. I basically woke up each day or each morning, I went and checked the website until they became available. I will say this year, I could have ordered chestnuts all through October and all through November. So there was a good 2-month window where I could order as many chestnuts as I wanted. So there is no real shortage, or there's no real shortage. It's just a matter of waiting for the right time, and you will get all the chestnuts that you could possibly want. So like I mentioned earlier, my soil wasn't ideal, so I wanted to do some sort of test. So when I ordered the chestnut seeds, I also found another orchard that's selling bare root Chinese trees. These, when they came, they're only like a foot tall. They look like a little twig, like a foot tall twig with a little tiny group of roots. And I planted them in the same way that I planned on planting my seedlings, using the tree shelter, basically the same area where I was planting where I planned on planting the orchard. So then in that next year, when they grew just fine throughout the growing season, that gave me confidence to continue with my plan of planting well over 100 chestnut trees. So by November, you should have your bag of chestnuts. And when it comes to taking those chestnut seeds from the seed to a sprout, The cheapest, easiest, and pretty much the most foolproof way that I have found anyways is referred to as the bucket method. So we first need to find a place to bury the buckets. I have a 3-year-old pile of arborist mulch. So I clear away a section and I bury the bucket level with the ground. I then cover the bucket with about 6 to 8 inches of the mulch. The mulch layer keeps the bucket away from the bitter cold. It does save a little digging, and it's a little easier to uncover and find the buckets in the spring. However, I have buried a bucket in the dirt only, and I got the same results. You just need to bury it 3 to 4 inches below the surface, or make sure there's like 3 to 4 inches of sand in your bucket to give that protective layer. The primary reason for the bucket is to protect the chestnut seeds from rodents, and it is easier to collect them in the spring instead of having to dig through the ground. You can also use any bucket. My buckets are 5-gallon buckets used for paint. You just make sure they're cleaned out really good. You can also purchase some. If you don't have any, you can get 5-gallon or 3-gallon buckets from almost any of the big box stores. It really doesn't matter. You'll just get more in the 5-bucket gallon than the 3. You can construct the bucket by just cutting a couple of big holes in the bottom. I left a centerpiece here to support this 1/4 inch hardware cloth. The 1/4 inch, it keeps the sand from falling out, but it also allows it to drain, and it keeps the rodents out. I'm sure you could also just drill a bunch of holes in the bottom if you don't have hardware cloth laying around. I probably would have done that, but I had this hardware cloth. Later on, you'll see in the lids, I did just do that. I just drilled a bunch of 3/8 inch holes to allow the water to get in, but again, keep the critters out. So I'm going to do a quick check to make sure the buckets fit in the hole before I go fill them with sand and chestnuts. When it comes to filling the buckets, you make sure your hardware cloth's down there, or again, your holes in the bucket. You start with about 1 inch of sand at the bottom. Then you throw in about 17 to 20 chestnuts evenly spaced, and then you add another layer of dirt. I just dumped a shovelful. It ended up being maybe about 1/2 inch of sand on top of the chestnuts. There's nothing critical about these measurements, and as a matter of fact, I'm being way too careful here. Later on, when I did my second round of chestnuts, I just tossed a handful of chestnuts in, quickly gave them a count, and just kind of evenly spaced them out. You repeat that until the bucket's full. I typically get about 7 to 8 layers, and about 17 to 20 chestnuts in each layer, which gives me about 150 chestnuts for a 5-gallon bucket. Once your bucket is full, you place it in the ground. You make sure that the sand is wet. I added about 1 gallon of water this year because the sand that I used was quite dry. Last year, I just dumped like 1/2 gallon because the sand was actually already wet. Again, this is not critical. If you have the holes in the top and the bottom, the moisture should get pretty much level with whatever is in your ground over time. You can see the lids here have a 3-inch holes for, again, let the water in and then keep the rodents out. And after you have these buried, you're pretty much done until the spring. As soon as the ground is thawed and workable, you should be able to pull your buckets out. In this video, it's mid-April, and I probably should have been about a month earlier and pulled these out in mid-March, but I wasn't ready to move my sprouts. I quickly got tired of digging because I couldn't find the bucket, so I switched to my tractor. So that there's another hint to make sure that you clearly mark the spot or measure. I thought I did. I clearly didn't. So this year I actually just left a pile of dirt directly next to where I buried the buckets. So it should be a little easier this next year. Here again, I am being way too careful. Later on, I just lay the bucket on the side and just start wrenching the sand away. You do need to be cautious and careful. You don't want to break the roots off, but out of the 250 so I sprouted, I only found a couple that had the root broken. I'm sure I did that. But again, they're not as fragile as you first think when you see them. You need to make sure that you are ready to take your sprouted chestnuts and put them into the pots or an air table, or plant them directly in the ground when you dig them up. If you pull them out of the ground and you're not ready to do something, you kind of run the risk of them drying out or freezing in a late frost. Here's the reason you need to be ready to plant your chestnuts as soon as you pull them out. I got excited and I pulled this bucket out as soon as I could to see if it was successful. But I had nowhere to put them. And by the time I ordered the pots, built the table, I forgot about them, or basically forgot about keeping them watered. So I'm pretty sure they dried out. And most of these ended up having these black roots. In the end, I still got about 30 chestnuts to end up growing. I planted probably about 60 of them in pots, and only about half of them actually ended up coming up. So I would definitely consider the bucket a failure. I probably should have just buried it, I should have pulled it up, made sure it was okay, and buried it right back in the ground, but I didn't, and that was definitely a mistake. So at this point, once I went through the buckets, I could see how much success I had in sprouting. I got chestnuts from two different places. Earlier I mentioned the Valley chestnuts. I also got them from a place called Cedar Hill. So the Valley chestnuts, I paid $52 for the 5-pound bag. I ended up with 135 that sprouted. So that came to about 40 cents per tree. And then Cedar Hill was about $40 for the 5-pound bag, and 88 of them sprouted. And so that came to about 45 cents per tree. This included that failed bucket. So if I would have did something better with that bucket and not had that failure, I'm guessing I probably would have been easily under the 40 cents mark. This year I ordered more expensive actual seed chestnuts, or what is advertised as seed chestnuts. The Valley Hill and the Cedar Hill, neither one of them were marketed as, quote, seed chestnuts. They're basically just fresh chestnuts. So these seed chestnuts, they came to $80 a pound. So next year I'm hoping for better results, both with, having some practice and these actually being seed chestnuts. But taking into account the extra cost, even if I get 100% success rate, it will still be about 10 cents more per sprout, or somewhere around 50 cents per sprout. So, we'll see. Most orchards sell culinary chestnuts, and then there's a few out there that will also sell seed chestnuts. And the difference really comes down to two areas. The first one is processing. Your culinary chestnuts will certainly be cleaned. The ones I got were spotless. You'd put them on your kitchen counter, and you wouldn't think of it at all. The other thing is they've most likely been refrigerated, either because they're waiting to ship them, or they're actually curing them. You cure chestnuts in the refrigerator. The third one, which is, some may or may not do this, it has to do with pest management. And one of the processes that I know about is to basically put them in hot water, about 120 degrees, for like 10 or 15 minutes or something like that. And I believe that's for the chestnut weevil. That versus seed chestnuts, there should be minimal, if any, processing at all. Maybe they put them in cold storage until they ship them or something. But they'll most likely be dirty. Mine were dirty. They had, like when I picked up the bag of nuts, I could feel a little grit on my hands. The second area is they typically talk about what makes them special. Maybe that's the named variety they came from, or maybe it's because they take them from the best trees in their orchard, or something along those lines. I personally went with seed chestnuts this year is because it was convenient, and because I was looking for genetic diversity. And so when I looked at the list, Route 9 Cropper had a bunch of descriptions on there, and one of the descriptions I liked, and I went with it. Again, it was primarily for genetic diversity, though. I also kind of want to see if there's an actual viability difference between the seeds, to see if more of them sprout or not. But that's just kind of a curiosity more than anything. So I think when you are choosing between culinary or seed chestnuts, I think it really comes down to your opinion and really what you plan on using the orchard for. Because I am planting these in my own orchard, I chose to place my Chinese chestnut sprouts into pots that were narrow and deep. These are 4 inches square and about 12 inches deep. I ordered 400 of them from Amazon. This deep pot gives the sprout plenty of room to grow its taproot, and it gives me all season to plant before the root hits the bottom of the pot. I also wanted the freedom to plant throughout the season, and we have some pretty hot and dry months. So the potting soil holds water pretty well. Because this was my first time, I also wanted to know what the success rate was, going from the sprouts to the trees. I figured that way it would prevent me from having to replant any if I planted the sprout and it never turned into a tree. I did only have 5 or 6 die, so that was pretty successful. That's not including the black rooted ones. About half of those never came up, probably even more than half never even came up. But of the healthy looking roots, I only had 5 or 6 of them die. You could plant them directly in the ground at this point. It would allow you to basically skip the round of transplanting. Another option is to place them in an air pruning table. All these options, once you take them out of the ground, you're leaving them open to being eaten by wildlife. That's why my table is completely enclosed. It has the cage on the sides, the bottom, front, and back. I'll likely make some modifications to this table. For one thing, it was kind of meant to be an air pruning table, and then I got the pots. So having that cage underneath, it didn't really do anything. The other problem is that it is, because it's off the ground, the weeds basically grew from the ground right up and through the cage. So I'll probably put weed fabric under it, cut the legs off, and just set it on the ground. It would have been a lot easier to build it that way from the start, but again, I thought it was going to be like an air pruning table of some type, but it didn't. That's not the function that came out of it. So this brings us to about May and June. This video is specifically May 16th, which is 1 month after moving the sprouts into the pots. For the most part, from when you plant the seedlings until June is just a matter of just keeping the new trees watered. This is 5 weeks on May 21st, and if you use the garden soil like me, you will have these weeds coming up. You could also just use bag potting soil or something, and it'd probably remove a lot of the weeds here. This is 6 weeks on June 2nd. You can see lots of vegetation growing. This is 8 weeks on June 17th. And finally, about 12 weeks later on August 14th. Going back to June, I'm just doing some prep work here. I'm cutting weed fabric. Chinese chestnut trees will do much better, and as will most trees, if they do not have any of the weed pressure. This means killing any of the weeds, grass, vegetation within about a 3-foot radius of the tree for like the first 3 to 5 years. This can be done with chemicals. You can spray around it with like something like oust, I've heard. I just prefer not to spray anything, and so I'm just using the woven weed fabric. The key point is that it is the fabric that is woven with like thin strips. They're maybe like an 1/8 inch wide, and they weave them together. I use 3.2 ounce fabric at least, and I use the stuff that at least claims a 5-year warranty from a reputable manufacturer. I bought this in the big box stores, and I bought it on Amazon, and so far it seems to be working pretty well. Most of the weave fabrics available in stores are not woven. They're more of like a material of some sort. Either I've seen them like thin pressed. It looks like they just blew strands of plastic and then pressed them together into a thin thing. But in either case, neither one of these will last long in the sun. So you want to make sure that it like on the label, it at least says something about being UV protected. Here I'm cutting the hole for the tree in the center. I later switched to just cutting like an X for the tree to grow through. This was faster to cut and eliminated me throwing away that little scrap in the middle. And I also figured these flaps would, when you put it over the tree, the flaps would lay right up against the tree tube. Some suggest bulky wood chips to be placed on top of the plastic or on top of the fabric. The idea is something bulky that has no nutritional value. This will cause the fabric to last longer. It'll protect it from the sun even more. But in my experience, over time, dirt and lawn clippings still get, even if you use the big chips and you never want to use the arborist. That basically is going to degrade pretty fast. But even if you use big chips or some sort of hardwood or bark, it's still over time the lawn clippings or something get blown in there, and then the weeds grow in there. And once the weed starts, that little thing will grow roots right through that, whatever weed fabric you put down. So I decided not to place anything on top of the fabric. I figure in a few years, I will just remove whatever fabric is left there, and I will mow right up to the base of the tree. In July, my wife and I planted 26 trees. We added these to the 4 test trees to see how well they would do. I'm both worried about the ground and like with the wildlife and the deer. So all of this I did these in chunks. I didn't just go out there and just plant a bunch of stuff. So I did everything in like small batches first to see if anything failed miserably to make sure I might want to change something. But these trees took about 15 minutes each to plant, which we did improve later on, like getting set up and figuring out how to plant them for the first time. It just kind of takes a little bit. A few weeks later, they all seemed fine. I think it was around 100 trees over the next couple days we did after we did those initial 26. I tried several methods for preparing the area. I did some push mowing and some raking to get rid of the grass. The push mowing was frustrating since you have it low to the ground and you're trying to mow right across the ground, and it left a lot of the clippings that you end up having to rake off anyways. So I switched to the rider. The rider could mow practically right to the ground with no effort, and it blew the clippings plenty far away from the spot that we were planting the trees. Even if it mowed a patch 3 times bigger, it was way better. And then you couldn't even tell in a few weeks anyways. As for flame weeding, even though it rained that day before I did this and I wet the ground down with like a little sprayer, I just didn't feel safe. I continued with the flame weeding for a couple batches, but it didn't provide any value really, and there's just too much of a safety factor with an open flame like that. So I stopped doing that. We planted the trees in the 20 by 20 square pattern. This means we will likely have to thin them out in about 10 years. I have been wondering about how it's done in China. I was watching a video and they mentioned that they have higher yield rates. I have a feeling it has something to do with the way they prune them, how close they are, that type of thing. The problem is there's virtually no information about how it's done. I have searched. There's very little information about Chinese chestnut tree orchards to begin with, because they are a relatively newer thing. I mean, decades, but newer than what we do with like apples or other fruit trees. So right now it's probably just more of an experiment. But my guess is that with the 20 by 20 pattern, we'll probably thin most of them out by half, and maybe I'll leave a few rows to do some experimental pruning of some sort. Initially, we did our best to keep things straightish, the rows of the trees. What we did is we planted the first, those 26 plus the 4 test ones. We had 30 to go from, so we had rows of like 4 or 5 trees. And what we would do is we'd stand on the other end of the field and we would just look down to try to get those trees to kind of line up. And then we just put stakes, eyeballing it to make a straight line. Once I got the hang of things, like what to do and what supplies and stuff like that, my son and my brother came over and helped for a little bit. Things went a lot faster with some help. I think we were getting down to like 5 minutes per tree on average. We used a little trenching shovel to dig holes just big enough for the Chinese chestnut seedlings, or I should say the pots that we were using. The trenching shovel that I had was like 4 inches wide, and I think it was 5 inches actually. So it's just almost the same width as the pots we were using. When we put them in the ground or we dug this hole, I was leaving the tree up like an inch. I didn't know if the tree would sink. I wasn't really sure if I was going to use wood chips or not. So I just gave myself a little bit of safety. I also heard that if the tree trunk that is above the ground in your pot goes below the ground, it doesn't do well. I don't know how serious that is, but either way, I gave myself about an inch. I left the top of the pot to be about an inch off the ground when I buried it, and then I just kind of put a little mound around it. So before planting the seedlings, we made sure to cut off any side branches, or if there were what looked like 2 trunks coming up, I just got rid of the weaker one. So in the end, there was basically just a single tree trunk going straight up, and that's what we planted in the ground. We used 6-foot T-post stakes. People have mentioned things like steel rebar or the fiberglass rebar. I found the fiberglass to be totally flimsy. Like it just blows side to side. The steel rebar is definitely way stronger. The problem is you either have to buy in 10 or 20 foot lengths, and then you're cutting it up, or you're figuring out how to get 20 foot lengths home if you want to get the cheapest price for it. And for me, the difference in the 6-foot T-post versus the rebar was only about $1, and I just didn't feel like it was worth the hassle. And the T-post is a way better stake. It has like a little plate on the end of it that keeps it nice and sturdy and upright. So I just went with the T-post. I was driving these in the ground about 18 inches. So what is that? That leaves about 4.5 feet of post sticking out of the ground. The tree tubes that I purchased, they were from Plantra. They're 71 inches. They're the tallest ones they sell, as far as I know. That meant that my T-post was below it, and it's actually below, like they have little holes that you put your some tie wraps on to hold it to the post, and it was even below that. So we'll get into the details of that later. But the reason I went with Plantra is that they seem to be the best quality. They are vented. There is some warning that if you plant, there is some tree tubes out there that are not vented, that these trees won't do well without having some of that ventilation. They'll overheat in the hot part of the summer. So the Plantra tubes were also the best price I could find, as long as you purchase them in quantities of 100 and you purchase them directly from Plantra. I looked at several brands and other suppliers, and I just couldn't find a better price. Again, as long as you purchase 100, the price drops off pretty quickly as you work your way up to 100, and then when you go beyond 100, the discount doesn't seem to fall off that fast. So 100 seemed to be about the sweet spot. Each tube does come with 3 tie wraps, or each tube comes with 3 tie wraps. Initially, I only used the 2 because, again, I was pounding the stake in, We just put the one at the far bottom and then the one in the middle. We put the tie wrap on, and we'll get back to the third tie wrap in a bit. Earlier, when I mentioned cutting an X inside of the, or for the tree hole, you can see that here. Each of these plastic pieces took 8 staples. I put one in each corner, and then I put a staple along each of the edges. This holds it down nice and secure and allows me to actually drive the lawnmower. The deck of the lawnmower goes right over top of the plastic. Because if you've ever sucked a piece of this plastic up, I've done this like in my landscaping. It is all kinds of frustration. The sound of it whipping in your lawnmower, and then the pieces just blow everywhere, and then you basically get off the tractor and you're picking up a bunch of pieces of plastic, let alone having to go back and redo work you've already done. So you really should use plenty of staples. Again, I used 8, and at this point I've kind of learned this lesson with basically landscaping around my house and in my garden. I use plenty of staples. I now buy them in boxes of 1,000, and I think I've at least bought at least 3, maybe 4 boxes of 1,000 staples. And you should worry about, there's 4-inch and 6-inch. I get the 6-inch staples. It probably depends on what your yard's like, but the 4-inch ones just don't seem to, like when you press them in the ground, they don't really seem to have any resistance. Whereas the 6 inches, they do. Once they get 6 inches deep, you can feel that they're gripping the ground. For the third tie wrap, I had to come back and make some custom holes. Again, because we used 6-foot T-posts, and when we pounded them down, the top of the post went below where planter put the tended holes. So we just went back, we drilled a couple holes, and we put that third tie wrap at the very top of the T-post. We initially placed the bird netting on top of the tubes, and it just blew off. I did go back and I tried putting on differently, and eventually it did just blow off. I did look up why is it critical to put these nets on top of the tubes, and they mentioned the birds falling into the tube. And it was, I don't know, maybe it was a week later or a few days later, but sure enough, when I was out there kind of checking things, I found a bird. I heard an animal scratching in the bottom of the tube. I went over there, and it was a bluebird. So I just picked up the tube. It flew away. That was fine. Thing is, by the time I ordered some tie wraps, some small ones, so that I could tie wrap these netting on top. By the time I did get those ordered, and I got them out there, and I got the time to get out there, I did find another bluebird. I'd certainly put the nets up there. I think you just need to be prepared with some tie wraps and a drill to make your own little hole and tie wrap them on. Later, I figured I would use the same hole to put a piece of foam. But once that tree grows past the top of the tube, the wind blows it around, and it scars. It'll put like a scar ring around the trunk of the tree. So what I found, or at least what I'm using, is the same insulation you put around, like you can get at the hardware store. It goes around pipes. You need some pretty big stuff. I think it's like 3-inch. But then you just cut a couple inches of that, stick it inside the tube, and then you put a piece of tie wrap to hold that from slipping down or blowing off itself. And then the tree will bounce around that foam. That foam is probably not UV resistant. I don't know if it'll last, I don't know how long it'll last, but at the moment it's the best option I found anyways. So that is my orchard so far, and by the fall of 2025, I hope to have about 300 Chinese chestnut trees. I'll provide some updates along the way, especially in the spring. And so if you learned anything or enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. And I'll see you next time.